Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are in Matthew chapter 22, and we're going to be talking about the greatest command, the greatest commandment. And this will be, here's the challenge right here. Here's the challenge. If Jesus gave us the greatest command, okay, think about this. If Jesus gave us the greatest command, so to break this command, wouldn't it be the greatest sin? In other words, if you want to say if this is the greatest commandment, then wouldn't this be the greatest sin? Um, now, and I'm not here necessarily to, of course, do a deep dive into that. It is important that we understand, I think, the concept of if Jesus is telling us that the greatest command, and I'm going to say this, is love God, then the greatest, the greatest sin should be, in our minds, the greatest sin should be not to love. And yet, think about this. How many times do we really, really comprehend? You know, how many times do we uh, think about when we're not loving? That we're actually breaking the greatest command, right? And by the way, let me just say this: this is a love. I mean, it's a command. So there are really two commandments. That one would be to love God, and then the second commandment would be to love one another. Okay, to love one another. So, well, let's get into it because again, I think this is I'm kind of I think these are one of these challenging verses. So let's pull it up. Let me see, where am I at here? Oh, got to share my screen. Here we go. All right. Let's see. Now, remember in the last study we looked at the Sadducees question, which is one of the most stupidest questions they can ask, only because everybody knows what they believe. So they're going to come to Jesus and on the sly try to, Jesus, we know that you are, a man of truth, and that I think about it. We know that you are. Um, well, I'm trying to look here. I said, where did that hit? The same day I just questioned him, teacher. No, that's not. Where's the one here? Now this was the one before, right? It was the Pharisees when they said, the Pharisees and the Herodians that said, we know that you are truthful and teaches truthfully the way of God. So the idea was that this is so deceptive, right? As if Jesus didn't know this. And then they, because if they really believed that Jesus was truthful and that he was teaching truthfully the way of God, why weren't they believing in him? Then the Sadducees came, and then and by the way, it was the same day. So think about this: the same day the Sadducees came, and they really thought, man, they kind of probably you can imagine that they were huddled someplace really kind of crafting this, like we're really going to get him that, hey, Jesus is, and they had, again, this crazy custom, which made its way into the law of Moses, that, and we read it, but if, and by the way, there was no consequences for you not obeying this command, but it was that if a man, if you have a man who has a wife, and then he dies without having any male children, then his brother was to marry the wife, and then the first child that was born, the first male child that was born, would carry on the dead brother's name. I think it's one of the most bizarre things, Tom. And then if he didn't want to do it, then she was taken before the court and then basically said, oh, this man, he become the man who wouldn't wear a sandal or something like that, right? And she would, I think, spit in his face or something like that. Okay, and some people be like, well, I ain't marrying you, right? All right, so the same day, they're kind of firing these questions, and he says, you're deceived because you don't know the scriptures of the power of God. Now, verse 34, so when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they came together, and one of them, an expert in the law. Now, remember, the Pharisees were just that. They were the experts of the law. They knew the law, which makes their sin even greater. It makes their sin even greater because they knew, they know this. They know that they're sinning. And wait till we get to the crucifixion, because literally they're going to be fulfilling prophecy as they speak. Right? So watch this. He says, so when the Pharisees heard that he has silenced the Sadducees, but he silenced them too, okay, they came together, and one of them, an expert in the law, asked a question to test him. Now, it kind of starts off as a test. It says, teacher, which command in the law is the greatest? You know what's interesting? In all of, even, I'm going to expand this to Christianity. In all of Christianity, and by the way, most of Christianity, in one form or another, teaches, practice some form of work salvation, meaning that they have to do something, live some way, act some way in order to make heaven their home, in order to go to heaven. Most of Christianity teach that. And so various denominations teach various things. Like, okay, you got some denominations that their main thing is you got to get baptized in water. That is the most important command to them. You have to get baptized in water. If you don't get baptized in water, you're not going to heaven. And that is the greatest command to them. There are others that say that the greatest command is to live in a particular definition of holiness, which really comes down to their definition of what is worldly and what is not. Women can't wear pants, jewelry, or makeup. They call that holy. Right? And if you do that, you're going to go to heaven. If you don't do what they call worldly things like curse and I'm not advocating that you do these things, but this is what they teach, that if you don't do these things, drink liquor, smoke, dance, go to music, those things, that's what they call holy. Then of course there's the mother church, Catholics, that teach, works with faith and just doing all of the good works that the Catholics prescribe that are good works. Okay? So you can just go on and on, different denominations that teach that you must do something in order to make heaven your home. And yet what is interesting is here Jesus is saying to a Pharisee, an expert in the law, who teaches the 613 commands of the law, that the greatest commandment He asked them, what is the greatest commandment? And the thing about it is that this is what they don't teach. Now here's Jesus saying this is the greatest. And again, so I asked the question again, if this is the greatest commandment, then wouldn't it be the greatest sin? And of course we don't see it that way. We don't look at it that way. So verse 37 says, he said to him, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. This is the greatest, now get this, and most important command. And then it said the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commands. Now, when we get to the New Testament, we drop the Old Testament law, but these two commandments remain. Now, the difference is that these are not based upon salvation. In other words, under the law of Moses, you keep the commands in order to be just. Which, by the way, sinful men cannot keep the law, cannot keep the commands. And thank God for Jesus. Thank God that Jesus is the propitiation for our sins. But notice this, love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your mind. You're to love God with your all. And then he says, this is the greatest command. All right, this is the greatest command. The greatest command. That's wow. Okay. So he says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind. This is the greatest and most important command. How many of us think that way though? That to love God, first of all, love God with your all. To love God with your all. And then he says, the second is like this, love your neighbors yourself. And then notice the law and the prophets, all the law and the prophets depend on these two. Now, if you think about the commands themselves, right? You think about the commands. Let me do this. Let me go to the commands. I think I want Exodus chapter, I think I want chapter 20. All right, so here it is. And this is, famously the 10 commandments. And again, there were actually more than 10 commandments. But listen to what he says here. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God that brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Do not have other gods beside me. Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in shape or anything in heaven or above, on the earth below, or in the waters underneath the earth. You must not bow down to them to worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the father's sin to the third and fourth generations of those that hate me. So always keep that in mind, that's those that hate me. He said, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and then keep my commandment. Do not misuse the name of the Lord your God, because the Lord will not leave anyone unpunished who misuse his name. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and you are to labor 6 days and to do all your work. But on the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. You must not do any work. You, your son, your daughters, your male, your female slaves, your livestock, or the foreigner who is within your gates. The Lord God made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything in them in 6 days, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and declared it holy. Now, remember Jesus says all of the prophets, all of the law and the prophets hang on these, the two commandments: love the Lord your God with your all, and you love your neighbors yourself. That was the first commandment. The first command right there, the first command. Okay, the first commandment. Okay, so love the Lord your God. And all of these commands, let's see. So, I mean, you can basically say 4 commandments, but they all center around what? Worship to God, devotion to God, right? Now look at this. Look what we consider the second command. He says, honor your father and your mother, so that you may have a long life in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Paul calls this the first commandment with a promise. But the reason why I want to point this is that the second commandment said to what? The Lord, to love your neighbor as yourself. So this is how I would love my neighbor. So children, honor your father and mother. Then notice this, do not murder. Great love your neighbor command. Do not commit adultery. Great commandment, right, to love your neighbor. Do not steal. Do not give false testimony against your neighbor. Do not covet your neighbor's house. Do not covet your neighbor's wife, his male or female slave, ox, a donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So all of the second commandment, you can see here. If we do just, so here it's interesting. If we just do the 2 commandments, right? You keep the law. If you just do the 2 commandments, and in the New Testament, that's the focus. We love one another, and then we love God and we love one another. But think about this. All of this is the loving of your neighbor. I mean, loving of your neighbor. And think about this. Loving your neighbors yourself. Because certainly you would not want your neighbor murdering you. You don't want your neighbor committing adultery with your wife, right? You don't want your neighbor stealing from you. You certainly don't want your neighbor giving false testimony against you. You don't want your neighbor coveting what is yours, right? Right? And so that's what he says, right? So the first 2 commandments, to love your neighbor as yourself. Now let's look at just one. You know what? Let me do this. Go to Romans. I can go to this really quickly. I believe I want Romans 14, and I want to show you the continuity into the New Testament. Here we go. I want to show to see. Let me go back to 13. Here we go. Look at verse 8. This is Romans 13, verse 8 says, do not owe anything except to love one another. For the one who loves one another has fulfilled the law. And he says, and then the commandments. Do not commit adultery. Do not murder. Remember I said that second one, those were the love not your neighbor. Here's Paul citing that. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not covet. And whatever other commandment are all summed up by this: love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to his neighbor. Love, therefore, is the fulfilling of the law. So if you are truly keeping, and what's always amazing how, see, the bad thing about religion, it picks and chooses its commands and then glorifies it. So like I say, a person who gets baptized in water, oh, I got baptized in water, so I'm holy or whatever. What about this command right here? In other words, why aren't we majoring in this? And by the way, I'm not even telling you not to get baptized. I'm certainly saying you don't get baptized to be saved. But notice, this is what we should be majoring in: loving one another. All right. And then before I get out of here, let's go to John. Let's go to John chapter 13. Okay. And here's what Jesus says, John chapter 13. Look at verse 34. He says, I give you a new command. Love one another just as I have loved you. You must also love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. All people will know that you have love for one another. I give you a new command, right? Notice, a new command, love one another as I have loved you. So why isn't this the major? Okay, why don't we, how is it that we're not majoring in this great command of love? Okay, now, sorry, here we go. All right, so the great command about love. So now, in the other Gospels, the guy who asked the question was so stunned by that, he says, you have answered well. There is no other greater commandment. We'll get that. Of course, we're going to get to that to another gospel. But his response, and actually Jesus says to him, you are not far from the kingdom of heaven. You're not far. Notice Jesus said you're not far. But that perception says that to love God is greater than all of the burnt offerings. I'm going to expand that. To love God is greater than all of your works that you think you have to do, your holiness, your good deeds. Because this is what God tells us to major in: loving one another. Loving God and then loving one another. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. I'll see you in the next study.